The silence in my kitchen wasn't the peaceful kind I'd spent 30 years cultivating. It was heavy, jagged, and smelled faintly of the expensive cologne my son-in-law, Cade Vane, wore like a suit of armor. He stood there, leaning against my hand-carved oak island, looking at my home, the Beaumont Sanctuary, not as a place of refuge, but as a line item on a balance sheet. I didn't know it then, but that rainy Tuesday morning in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, was the beginning of a war that would eventually make national headlines. "It's about dignity, Arthur," Cade said, his voice smooth and cold, like a river stone. "You're 72. This house is nearly 4,000 square feet. You're rattling around in here like a ghost. My parents, Silas and Martha, they're struggling with the stairs at their place. It only makes sense. You move into the Laurels, it's a premium assisted living facility, and they move in here to look after the property. It stays in the family." I looked at him, really looked at him. I'd spent 40 years as a chaplain and a foster father, and I'd learned to read the tell on a man's face. Cade had the look of a man who'd already spent the money he hadn't made yet. "The family," I repeated quietly. "That's a curious word for you to use, Cade. Don't get philosophical on me," he snapped, his patience thinning. "I've already booked the movers for Friday. The deposit for the Laurels is paid. You'll have a lovely view of the mountains, a meal plan, and people your own age. You're becoming a liability here, and frankly, Eleanor is tired of worrying about you." My heart took a hit at the mention of my daughter's name. I'd raised Eleanor since she was 6 years old. She was the first child I'd ever officially adopted, a girl who had seen things no child should ever see. I'd spent a decade stitching her soul back together. To hear her name used as a weapon by a man like Cade, a high-stakes real estate shark with a grin like a razor blade, felt like a betrayal I wasn't prepared for. But what Cade Vane didn't understand was that I wasn't alone. He saw a retired old man in a frayed cardigan. He didn't see the army standing behind me. He didn't see the 52 children who had passed through these halls, many of whom were now the very people he spent his life trying to impress. "Friday is 3 days away. Cade," I said, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. "Plenty of time for a man with no hobbies," he replied, checking his gold watch. "I'll have the paperwork for the deed transfer sent over this afternoon. Since you're not Eleanor's biological father, the legalities are a bit of a headache, but my lawyers have a workaround. It's better this way, Arthur. Let the real family take the reins." He left without saying goodbye, the door clicking shut with a finality that should have terrified me. Instead, it lit a fire in my gut that I hadn't felt since I was a young man defending my first foster placement from a crooked social worker. I walked down the hallway of the Beaumont Sanctuary. The floorboards creaked in familiar pitches. The third one from the door was a sharp G sharp. The one near the bathroom was a low C. I knew every inch of this house. I knew where Julian Montgomery had accidentally put a hole in the drywall with a football in Mtngin Chintrum Chinmui Tarm Julian, who was now a senior partner at one of the top law firms in Nashville. I knew the height marks carved into the pantry doorframe for Cassandra Kensington, who was currently a neurosurgeon in Chicago. Cade thought I was a simple man because I drove a 15-year-old truck and wore clothes from the local hardware store. He saw my modest pension and assumed I was vulnerable. He forgot that a man's wealth isn't measured by his bank account, but by the number of people who would drop everything to answer his call. I sat at my desk and pulled out a leather-bound address book. It wasn't just a list of names. It was a directory of the elite, the powerful, and the fiercely loyal. I picked up the phone and dialed a number I knew by heart. "Sterling residence," a professional voice answered. "I need to speak with Harrison," I said. "Tell him it's the shepherd calling. The gate is being threatened." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end. Harrison Sterling had been my difficult placement in the early Cheen Muse. He was a kid the system had written off as a future convict. Today, he owned half the commercial real estate in East Tennessee and had a seat on the governor's council. "Dad?" Harrison's voice came on the line seconds later, stripped of its corporate polish. "What's wrong? You never call this line." "Cade Vane was just here," I said, looking out the window at the rolling hills of Oak Ridge. "He's moving his parents in on Friday. He's moving me to a facility. He told me it was time for the real family to take over." The silence on Harrison's end was more terrifying than any shouting. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, vibrating growl. "He's trying to take the sanctuary?" "He says the movers are coming Friday at 9. "I see," Harrison said. "Dad, listen to me. Don't sign anything. Don't argue with him. Just keep the coffee on. I'm calling the others. I think it's time for a family reunion. And Arthur?" "Yes, son?" "Cade Vane is about to find out that biological is just a word. Family is a pact." I hung up the phone, but I didn't stop there. I called Vance Blackwood, a man who shared a surname with Cade's parents but none of their old money arrogance. Vance was a lieutenant in the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation. Then I called Dr. Sarah Miller, who ran the largest private hospital network in the state. By the time the sun began to set over the ridge, my phone was buzzing incessantly. Group chats I hadn't checked in months were exploding. The Beaumont kids were mobilizing. Wednesday morning brought a new development. Cade didn't just send the paperwork. He sent his father, Silas Vane. Silas was a man who looked like he'd been carved out of cold marble gray hair, gray suit, gray soul. He walked into my home without knocking, carrying a tape measure. "The master bedroom will need new flooring," Silas said, not even looking at me as he walked toward the stairs. "Martha hates this carpet. Too much history in it. And the study? It's too dark. We'll knock out that wall to get a better view of the valley." "This house is still in my name, Silas," I reminded him, standing at the base of the stairs. Silas stopped and looked down at me, a condescending smirk playing on his lips. "For now, Arthur, but Cade has been very thorough. He's discovered some interesting discrepancies in your foster care filings from the late 80s. Nothing a man your age wants to deal with in court. It would be a shame if your legacy was tarnished by a state investigation into financial mismanagement of foster funds, wouldn't it?" My blood ran cold. It was a lie, a total fabrication. But the threat was clear. They weren't just taking my house. They were willing to destroy my reputation to do it. They wanted to erase 30 years of service to ensure they had a nice retirement view. "You're threatening to frame me?" I whispered. "We're encouraging you to do the right thing," Silas corrected. "Cade is a powerful man in this county. He has friends in the DA's office. You're just a retired pastor who took in too many strays. Nobody is going to listen to you over us." He went back to measuring the hallway, whistling a tune as he planned the destruction of my sanctuary. I stayed in the kitchen, my heart hammering. I realized then that this wasn't just a greedy son-in-law. This was a family of predators who had been circling me for years, waiting for me to get old enough, weak enough, to strike. But they had made one fatal error. They assumed that because I was a man of peace, I didn't know how to wage war. They assumed my children were just strays who had moved on. That evening, Eleanor called. Her voice was small, distant. "Dad, Cade told me you agreed to the move. He said you were feeling overwhelmed. Is that what he told you, Eleanor? Or is that what you want to believe because it's easier than standing up to him?" "Dad, don't," she sobbed. He's in a lot of trouble. He's in debt to some people, and his parents' house is being foreclosed on. He needs this. He says if we get your house, he can leverage the land for a new development and clear his name. He said you'd understand, that you'd do anything for me." The missing piece of the puzzle clicked into place. This wasn't just about a retirement home for Silas and Martha. There was a developer involved. They wanted the land, the 12 acres of prime Tennessee hillside the sanctuary sat on. "I love you, Eleanor," I said, my heart breaking for the woman she had become under Cade's influence. "But you've forgotten who raised you. You've forgotten what this house represents. I won't let him destroy it. He's coming tomorrow with the final papers, Dad," she warned. "He's bringing a notary. He said if you don't sign, he's going to call the police and file for an emergency guardianship. He's going to tell them you've lost your mind." "Let him come," I said. I hung up and looked at the clock. It was Wednesday night. The movers were coming Friday. But Thursday was going to be the day the world changed for Cade Vane. What Cade didn't know was that Julian Montgomery wasn't just a lawyer. He was a shark who specialized in predatory real estate litigation. And Harrison Sterling didn't just own property. He owned the very bank Cade was in debt to. I sat on my porch as the fireflies began to dance in the grass. A black SUV pulled into my driveway, its headlights cutting through the dark. Then another, and another. The first person to step out was Harrison. He looked at the house, then at me. Behind him, a dozen more of my strays emerged from the shadows. They weren't kids anymore. They were a wall of influence, power, and righteous fury. "Status check?" Harrison asked, his voice echoing in the quiet night. "They're coming tomorrow for the signature," I said. "And they're threatening to bury my name if I don't give in." Harrison smiled, and it was a terrifying thing to see. "Well then, I think it's time we showed the Vanes what a real family looks like when they're provoked." He turned to the group. "Julian, you have the injunctions. Sarah, do you have the medical evaluation team ready to prove my father is more sane than the people attacking him? Vance, have you pulled the records on Cade's offshore debts?" Nods all around. But the real shock came when the last car door opened. A man stepped out that I hadn't seen in 15 years. Silas Blackwood Jr., Cade's own cousin, whom I'd fostered in secret after his own father had cast him out. "I have the keys to the Vane family vault, Pop," Silas Jr., his eyes hard. "And I think it's time we opened it up for the world to see." I looked at my children, my doctors, my soldiers, my lawyers, and for the first time in a week I breathed. Cade Vane thought he was coming to evict an old man. He had no idea he was walking into an ambush. The trap was set, but as I went to sleep that night, I couldn't help but wonder, what would happen when Eleanor saw the truth? And was I prepared for the collateral damage this war would cause? I didn't know it yet, but the moving truck on Friday would be the least of Cade's problems. By tomorrow morning, the Vane family name would be worth less than the dirt on my boots. The house felt alive that Thursday morning, a way it hadn't since the great reunion of Haing-in-Lair-Muiterm. But this wasn't a celebration. It was a war room. My strays, as Silas Vane liked to call them, had fanned out across the property with the silent efficiency of a specialized unit. Harrison Sterling was in the study, 3 laptops open, his fingers flying across the keys as he dismantled Cade's shell companies. Julian Montgomery was in the dining room, surrounded by leather-bound law books, preparing an injunction that would make a Supreme Court justice weep. I sat in my old recliner, watching them work. I remember when Harrison was 12, a wiry kid with a permanent scowl who had tried to set fire to my garage twice in his first month. Now, he was the man who could crash the Vane's credit score with a single phone call. I realized then that while Cade had been studying the deed to my house, he'd forgotten to study the history of the people who grew up inside it. I closed my eyes for a moment, and the memories of how we got here came rushing back like a flood. I'd first met Cade Vane 4 years ago at a fundraiser for the East Tennessee Children's Hospital. He was the golden boy of Oak Ridge real estate, a man who spoke in buzzwords and wore suits that cost more than my first car. Eleanor had been so radiant that night. She'd finally finished her master's in social work, and I thought she'd found a partner who matched her ambition. I didn't know it yet, but that night was the first time Cade began measuring the square footage of my soul. "Your father has quite the eclectic hobby," Cade had remarked that evening, sipping a bourbon that probably cost $50 a glass. He was looking at the table of foster kids I'd brought along. "Taking in the broken ones. It's noble, really. Very tax-deductible. I should have known then." The way he used the word broken. To me, those kids weren't broken. They were just in need of a different kind of glue. But to Cade, everything was a commodity. People were assets or liabilities. And as the years went by, I watched him systematically alienate Eleanor from the very family that had saved her. It started with small things. He'd suggest they spend Thanksgiving with his real family, the Vanes, instead of at the sanctuary. He'd make subtle comments about how the foster kids were draining my retirement. He'd tell Eleanor that she needed to think about her own future, her own bloodline, rather than the revolving door of strangers I kept in the guest rooms. "He's just being practical, Dad," Eleanor would tell me, her eyes losing that spark of independence I'd fought so hard to give her. "He wants us to have a legacy." But I knew Cade's version of legacy was just a pile of stolen gold. The tension grew over the last 18 months. Whenever Cade and Eleanor visited, the air in the house felt thin, as if he were sucking the oxygen out of the room. He'd walk through the hallways, tapping on the walls, checking for rot, looking at my collection of hand-painted plates from around the world as if they were trash. "You know, Silas and Martha are looking for a place near the ridge," Cade said during a Sunday dinner last July. "It's a shame this house is so underutilized. Imagine what a professional renovation could do here. We could flip the whole property for 3 times what you paid." "I'm not interested in flipping my home, Cade," I had replied. He just smiled that thin, predatory smile. "Of course not. Not while you're still capable." That was the first time he'd hinted at my age being a weapon he could use against me. He began a slow, agonizing campaign of gaslighting. He'd forget to tell me about family events, and then claim I was losing my memory when I asked why I hadn't been invited. He'd move things in my kitchen, put the flour where the sugar went, hide my reading glasses, and then exchange a concerned look with Eleanor when I couldn't find them. "Are you sure you're okay, Arthur?" he'd ask, his voice dripping with false empathy. "Maybe we should have a doctor look at your cognitive levels. You seem a bit foggy lately." I knew what he was doing, but Eleanor was blind to it. She saw a husband who was caring for her elderly father. She didn't see the wolf preparing to howl. Back in the present, the sound of a heavy engine pulled me from my thoughts. A sleek, black luxury SUV was pulling into the drive. Not Cade's. This belonged to Vance Blackwood, the lieutenant from the TBI. He stepped out of the car, adjusting his holster under his jacket. He looked toward the house and gave a sharp, professional nod. Vance had been the kid who never slept. He'd spend all night sitting by the window, watching the woods, terrified that his father would find him. I'd spent countless nights sitting with him, teaching him that he was safe. Now, he was the one providing the safety. "The vans are in motion, Pop," Vance said, walking into the kitchen and grabbing a mug of coffee. "I've got a unit tracking Silas's car. They're at the bank right now. It looks like they're trying to pull a fast one with a power of attorney document they think they have." "They think they have?" I asked. Vance grinned. "Julian and Harrison spent all night in the digital archives. That document Cade had you signed 6 months ago? The one he told you was a medical proxy for Eleanor? It was actually a broad-form power of attorney. But Cade made a mistake. A big one." "What kind of mistake?" "He used a notary who was already under investigation for fraud." Julian Montgomery called out from the dining room, stepping into the kitchen with a stack of papers. "And more importantly, he didn't realize that Harrison Sterling owns the title company that handles the Vane family's business. We've frozen the execution of that document. As of 20 minutes ago, Cade Vane is legally blocked from acting on your behalf." The relief was momentary, because I knew Cade. He wouldn't just walk away. He was desperate. Eleanor had mentioned his debts. A man like Cade, cornered and broke, was more dangerous than a man with a plan. "What about Eleanor?" I asked, the weight of her betrayal intentional or not pressing on my chest. "She's with him," Julian said, his expression softening. "She's in the car. They're headed here now. Arthur, you need to be ready. This is going to be ugly. They aren't just coming to sign papers anymore. They're coming to take you out of this house by force if they have to." I looked around my kitchen. My children, the ones Cade called temporary, were standing in the shadows of my home, waiting. They were the most powerful people in the state, and they were all here for me. At muy lama. Matter Cade's silver Porsche roared up the gravel driveway, followed closely by Silas Vane's Cadillac. They parked haphazardly, the doors flying open before the engines had even fully died. Cade stepped out first, looking disheveled. His tie was loose, his hair messy. Behind him, Eleanor looked like she'd been crying for days. Silas and Martha followed, Silas carrying a briefcase like it was a holy relic. I stepped onto the porch alone. My kids were out of sight, hidden in the study, the dining room, and upstairs. To Cade, I looked like a defenseless old man standing on a sinking ship. "Arthur," Cade shouted, marching toward the porch. "We're done playing games. The sheriff is on his way with an emergency order. You're being transitioned to the Laurels for your own safety. Your mental episodes have become a matter of public record." "I haven't had any mental episodes, Cade," I said calmly. "That's not what the papers say," Cade barked, waving a document in the air. "I have 3 statements from witnesses who say you've been wandering the property at night, confused and shouting. Eleanor even signed the petition." I looked at my daughter. She wouldn't meet my eyes. She was trembling, her hand gripped tight by Martha Vane. "Is that true, Eleanor?" I asked. "Did you sign a paper saying I've lost my mind?" "Dad," Cade said. "He said you were hurt," she whispered, her voice cracking. "He said you tried to burn the old photos. He said you didn't know who I was yesterday." The depth of his lies was staggering. He had fabricated entire events to trick my own daughter into betraying me. "I have the notary here," Cade said, gesturing to a nervous-looking man who had climbed out of Silas's car. "You're going to sign the deed transfer to Silas and Martha, right now. If you do, we'll make sure you stay in the gold wing of the Laurels. If you don't, I'm calling the psychiatric transport team, and you'll spend the rest of your life in a state ward." Silas stepped forward, his eyes cold and greedy. "Move aside, Arthur. This house belongs to the Vane legacy now. We're going to tear down that tacky sanctuary sign this afternoon." I took a deep breath and looked past them, toward the road. I saw the flash of blue and red lights in the distance. The sheriff Cade had called was arriving. Cade smirked, thinking he'd won. He thought the law was his personal cleaning service. "You really should have checked the visitor log this morning, Cade," I said softly. "What are you talking about?" Cade sneered. "I'm talking about the fact that you're trespassing," I said. I raised my hand. A simple gesture. The front door of the sanctuary swung open. Harrison Sterling walked out, followed by Julian Montgomery. From the side of the house, Vance Blackwood emerged, his TBI badge gleaming on his belt. From the balcony above, Dr. Sarah Miller looked down, her medical tablet in hand. The color drained from Cade's face so fast I thought he might faint. Silas froze, his hand still on his briefcase. "Cade," Harrison said, his voice like a gavel striking a bench. "I believe you're familiar with my firm. We represent the bank that currently holds the note on your parents' property, the one you tried to use as collateral for your failing development project. Cade stammered. Sterling, what are you doing here? This is a private family matter. That's where you're wrong, Julian added, stepping forward with a stack of legal documents. This is a Beaumont matter, and as the legal counsel for Arthur Beaumont and the Beaumont estate, I'm serving you with a standing restraining order. Furthermore, I've just filed a multi-million-dollar suit for elder abuse, fraud, and defamation. The sheriff's car pulled into the driveway, but instead of walking toward me, the officer, a man I'd known for 20 years, walked straight to Vance Blackwood. Lieutenant, the sheriff said, nodding to Vance. We're ready when you are. Cade looked around, trapped. He saw the strays he'd mocked. He saw the power he'd tried to steal, now turned against him like a tidal wave. Eleanor, get in the car, Cade hissed, grabbing her arm. We're leaving. These people have no right. Actually, Vance said, stepping in front of the Porsche. Nobody is leaving just yet. We have some questions about that notary you brought, Cade, and some very interesting files we found in your office last night. Cade's eyes darted toward the woods, looking for an exit that didn't exist. But it was Silas who made the biggest mistake. He lunged forward, trying to push past me to get into the house, screaming that the house was his. Vance moved faster than I'd ever seen him move. In seconds, Silas Vane was face down on the porch, his hands being pulled behind his back. Dad! Eleanor screamed, finally breaking free from Martha. She ran to the porch, looking at the chaos. But as the handcuffs clicked shut on Silas, a new car pulled into the driveway. It wasn't a luxury SUV. It was an old, battered sedan. A man stepped out that made even my children go silent. It was Leo Thorne, the one child I'd never been able to help. The one who had disappeared into the underworld 10 years ago. He walked toward us, his face scarred and his eyes dead. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at Cade. I heard there was a problem at the sanctuary, Leo said, his voice a low, terrifying rasp. I didn't know what Leo was doing here, but I saw the way Cade's knees buckled. It seemed Cade Vane had debts to people far more dangerous than the bank. What happened next changed everything, because as Leo approached, he didn't pull out a gun or a knife. He pulled out a recorded tape. You want to hear what Cade really thinks about your daughter, Arthur? Leo asked. The look on Eleanor's face told me that the real betrayal was only just beginning to surface. I didn't know it yet, but the house wasn't the only thing Cade was trying to steal. He was planning to vanish, and he wasn't planning on taking Eleanor with him. The gravel of the Beaumont sanctuary driveway seemed to hum under the weight of the silence that followed Leo Thorne's arrival. Leo didn't look like the scared 14-year-old I'd pulled out of a halfway house in Memphis all those years ago. He looked like a man who had walked through hell and decided he liked the heat. He held a small, battered digital recorder in his hand, as if it were a detonator. Cade Vane's face wasn't just pale anymore. It was the color of curdled milk. He looked at Leo, then at the TBI badge on Vance's belt, then at the line of luxury cars blocking his escape. He was a predator who had suddenly realized he was standing in a room full of apex hunters. Leo, wait, Cade stammered, his voice thin and reedy. Whatever you think you heard, it's out of context. I was under pressure. I was trying to protect Eleanor. Protect me? Eleanor's voice was a ghost of itself. She stepped toward Leo, her eyes fixed on the recorder. Leo, play it. Play it right now. I didn't know it yet, but the next 60 seconds would shatter the last 3 years of my daughter's life. Leo pressed the button. The audio was grainy, filtered through the sound of a moving car and the clinking of ice in a glass. But Cade's voice was unmistakable, arrogant, sharp, and utterly devoid of the warmth he'd used to woo my daughter. The old man is finally cracking, Cade's voice boomed from the speaker. I've got him second-guessing his own shadow. Another month of moving his meds and hiding his keys, and he'll be begging for a room at the Laurels. Eleanor? Please. She's a bleeding heart. I just have to keep her focused on saving him, and she'll sign whatever I put in front of her. Once the deed is in Silas's name, we liquidate the 12 acres to the Piedmont Group. I'm not spending another winter in this hillbilly town. I've already got the offshore account set up in the Caymans. Eleanor can stay here and play nursemaid to her father while I'm on a beach in Grand Cayman. The recording cut off. The only sound left was the wind whistling through the Tennessee pines and the ragged breathing of a woman whose world had just been exposed as a lie. Eleanor turned to Cade. The look in her eyes wasn't just anger. It was the cold, hard realization that the man she shared a bed with had been meticulously dismantling her father's mind for sport and profit. Moving my meds? I whispered, the pieces of the last 6 months finally clicking into place. The dizzy spells I'd had in October. the fog that seemed to roll in every afternoon after my tea. I'd thought I was dying. I'd thought I was losing my mind, just like my own father had. You were poisoning him? Vance Blackwood's voice was a low, dangerous vibration. He stepped toward Cade, his hand resting on the hilt of his weapon. You were tampering with a retired chaplain's heart medication to simulate dementia. It wasn't poison, Cade shrieked, backing away until he hit the side of his Porsche. It was just a sedative. A low dose. Just enough to make him compliant. My parents needed a place to live. We were in debt. Silas Vane, still pinned to the porch by the sheriff's deputy, let out a desperate cry. Cade, shut up. Don't say another word. But Cade was past the point of strategy. He was in full-blown survival mode, and in his world, survival meant stepping on everyone else. It was Silas's idea. Cade pointed a shaking finger at his father. He's the one who found the Piedmont group. He's the one who told me Arthur wasn't real family anyway. He said we were just taking back what should have belonged to a real Tennessee bloodline. I looked at Silas and Martha Vane. These were people I had invited to my table. I had shared my bread with them. I had treated them with the respect their gray hair demanded. To them, I was a foster father, a placeholder, a man whose 40 years of service were a clerical error in the grand ledger of real families. I raised her, I said, my voice finally finding its strength. I walked down the porch steps until I was standing inches from Cade. I sat up with her through the night terrors when she was 7. I worked 3 jobs to pay for her college. I held her hand when she walked across the stage to get her master's. You saw a deed, Cade. You saw acreage and square footage. But this house is built on the bones of children who had nowhere else to go. You didn't just try to steal a building. You tried to steal a sanctuary. Dad, I'm so sorry, Eleanor sobbed, collapsing onto the bottom step. I didn't see it. I wanted so badly for us to be a family, a normal family, that I let him blind me. Dr. Sarah Miller stepped forward and put a protective arm around Eleanor. He didn't just blind you, Elle. He groomed you. He used every psychological trick in the book to isolate you from us. But he forgot one thing. Sarah looked at the line of us, the strays. He forgot that when you mess with one Beaumont, you mess with all of us. What happened next changed everything. Cade, seeing the sheriff moving in with handcuffs, made a desperate, stupid move. He lunged for Leo, trying to grab the recorder, perhaps thinking he could destroy the evidence. Leo didn't even flinch. He caught Cade's wrist with a sickening crack and spun him around, slamming him face first into the hood of the Porsche. The luxury car alarm began to blare, a high-pitched wail that echoed across the ridge like a funeral dirge. You're not going to Grand Cayman, Cade, Leo whispered into his ear. You're going to a cell in Brushy Mountain, and I've made sure the guys inside know exactly what you did to an old man who spent his life helping kids like us. The sheriff took over, hauling Cade upright. As they led him and Silas away toward the cruisers, Martha Vane stood alone in the driveway, her designer handbag clutched to her chest. She looked at me, her eyes filled with a venomous spite that shocked me. You think you've won, Arthur? She hissed. You've just destroyed your daughter's marriage. You've ruined a prestigious family name. You're still an old man in a big house, and eventually, you'll be gone. And who will have this place then? These people? These nobodies you picked up off the street? Harrison Sterling stepped forward, his presence so massive it seemed to dim the sun. Actually, Mrs. Vane, I've already purchased the Piedmont Group's interest in this development. And as of 9 o'clock this morning, I've placed the entire 12 acres into a permanent, irrevocable trust. This property will never be sold. It will become the Beaumont Foundation for Foster Youth. It will belong to nobodies for the next 100 years. The look on Martha's face was the most satisfying thing I'd seen in a decade. She turned and fled toward her car, leaving her husband and son to the cold comfort of the law. As the police cars pulled away, the silence returned to the sanctuary. But it was a different kind of silence now. It was the silence of a house that had been purged. I looked at Eleanor. She was still on the steps, her head in her hands. The betrayal was so deep, so layered, that I knew it would take years for her to recover. She hadn't just lost a husband. She'd lost her sense of reality. What now, Dad? She asked, her voice small. Now, I said, offering her my hand. We go inside, we make a pot of coffee, and we figure out how to be a family again, a real one. But as we walked toward the door, Julian Montgomery caught my eye. He had a look on his face that I didn't like, a look of deep, professional concern. He held back, waiting until the others had filtered inside. Arthur, Julian whispered, pulling me aside. God, what is it, Julian? It's over, isn't it? The house is safe, Julian said, his voice low. And Cade is going away for a long time for the fraud and the tampering. But Vance found something else when he was digging through Cade's private server last night. Something Cade was using to keep Eleanor in line. My heart sank. What kind of something? Cade wasn't just after the house, Arthur. He was involved with some people Leo knows. He was using the Beaumont name to facilitate some very off-the-books transport through this county. There's a shipment scheduled to arrive at your back barn tonight, and the people coming for it? They don't care about deeds or lawsuits. They just want their cargo. I looked toward the old barn at the edge of the woods. I hadn't used it in years. I didn't know it yet, but the battle for the sanctuary was only half over. The Vanes were the legal threat, but the physical threat was still coming through the dark. Who are they, Julian? The Blackwood Syndicate, Julian said, his eyes glancing at Vance. Vance's biological family. The ones he's been running from his whole life. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Cade hadn't just tried to steal my home. He had turned my sanctuary into a drop point for the most dangerous organized crime ring in the state. And they were coming tonight. I looked at my children inside the house, the doctors, the lawyers, the survivors. I had spent 30 years keeping the world's darkness away from them. Now, that darkness was coming to my front door, and it was bringing the one thing Vance Blackwood feared most. What happened next changed the stakes of the game entirely. Because as the sun began to dip below the mountains, the first of the blacked-out SUVs appeared on the ridge road. They weren't the police, they weren't lawyers, they were the Blackwoods. And they wanted what was theirs. The golden hour in East Tennessee is usually a thing of beauty, a soft amber light that makes the ridges of the Smoky Mountains look like velvet. But that evening, as the sun dipped behind the pines, the light felt like a countdown. We had moved the coffee pot to the dining room, the center of the house, where the walls were thickest. The celebration of our legal victory against Cade and Silas had evaporated, replaced by a cold, tactical dread. Vance Blackwood stood by the window, his silhouette sharp against the fading light. He had traded his suit jacket for a tactical vest he'd pulled from the trunk of his TBI vehicle. He was checking the magazine of his sidearm, his movements mechanical and precise. I'd seen him do this 1,000 times, as a boy, not with a gun, but with his school bag or his shoes, preparing himself for a fight he knew was coming. I didn't know it yet, but the moment Cade mentioned the Blackwoods, he wasn't just talking about a business deal, Vance said, his voice devoid of emotion. He was talking about a death sentence. My biological father, Jax Blackwood, doesn't do business. He does ownership. If Cade used this barn to store their cargo, Jax considers this property his. And Jax doesn't believe in deeds or restraining orders. How did Cade even get involved with them? Eleanor asked. She was wrapped in a quilt, sitting on the edge of a chair, her face still puffy from crying. Desperation, Leo Thorne answered from the shadows of the hallway. He was sharpening a pocket knife with a whetstone, the rhythmic shick-shick sound the only heartbeat in the room. Cade was underwater with the Piedmont Group. He needed fast cash to keep the lights on at Vane Real Estate. The Blackwoods are the biggest distributors of hillbilly heroin and illegal firearms in the tri-state area. They need clean transit points. A respected foster home, a retired chaplain's barn. It's the perfect camouflage. No cop is going to kick in the door of Arthur Beaumont without a damn good reason. I felt a sickening wave of guilt wash over me. My home, my sanctuary, had been used as a warehouse for the very poison that had orphaned half the children I'd raised. Cade hadn't just tried to take my house. He had turned it into a tomb. Vance, I said, stepping toward him, you don't have to stay. If they're coming for you, they're not just coming for me, Pop, Vance interrupted, turning to face me. His eyes were hard, reflecting a trauma I thought we'd buried 20 years ago. They're coming for the shipment. If I leave, they'll burn this house down with you in it just to send a message. This is what the Blackwoods do. They're a clan, not a family. You stay, you serve, or you die. When you took me in at 14, you didn't just give me a home, you stole a soldier from Jax's army. He hasn't forgotten that. For 20 years, he's been waiting for a reason to step onto this dirt. What followed was a crash course in the reality of the Blackwood Syndicate. For the next hour, Vance and Leo laid out the stakes. There was a shipment of high-grade, stolen military-grade hardware stuff diverted from the bases in Kentucky sitting in my back barn. Cade had been the middleman, and tonight was the handoff. I've already called for backup, Vance said, checking his watch. But the nearest TBI units are 40 minutes out, and the local sheriff is tied up processing Silas and Cade at the county jail. We're on our own for the first wave. Not exactly on our own, Harrison Sterling said. He walked back into the room, having spent the last 30 minutes on his phone. I've got my private security detail on the way from Knoxville. 4 former Special Forces guys. They'll be at the gate in 20. The gate is already breached, Leo said quietly. We all froze. Lee pointed toward the monitors in the study, which were linked to the security cameras Cade had installed to monitor me. On the screen, 3 blacked-out SUVs had already pulled through the front gate, which had been left open by the departing police cruisers. They weren't rushing. They were moving with the slow, arrogant confidence of men who knew they owned the night. Julian, Sarah, get Eleanor and the kids upstairs to the safe room, Vance commanded. I'm staying here, Eleanor said, her voice trembling but firm. I brought that monster into this house. I'm not hiding while you all fix my mistake. This isn't a legal debate, Julian Montgomery said, grabbing her arm. This is a gunfight. Move. As Julian led Eleanor and the younger foster children, the ones who had stayed over for the reunion, up the creaking stairs, I looked at the men left in the room. Harrison, the billionaire. Vance, the lawman. Leo, the ghost. My strays had become the only thing standing between the sanctuary and a bloodbath. I'm going to the barn, Vance said. If I can secure the shipment, I can use it as leverage. I'm going with you, Leo added, his knife disappearing into his pocket. No, I said, my voice surprising even myself with its authority. Nobody goes to the barn alone. That barn is where we used to have the summer sleepovers. It's where you, Vance, learned to read. I know the layout better than anyone. There's a cellar entrance through the old tool shed that they won't see. Vance started to protest, but the sound of tires on gravel silenced him. The SUVs had stopped in the circular drive, right in front of the porch. The headlights stayed on, blinding us, bathing the living room in a harsh, artificial white light. A man stepped out of the lead vehicle. He was tall, wearing a heavy canvas coat and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. He didn't carry a gun in his hand, but he didn't need to. The 4 men who stepped out behind him were bristling with automatic weapons. Arthur Beaumont, the man shouted, his voice a gravelly rasp that sounded like dry leaves on a tombstone. I know you're in there, preacher. I don't want the house. I don't want your soul. I just want my property. Send out the boy and open the barn, and maybe I'll leave the house standing. That's Jack's, Vance whispered, his face turning a ghostly shade of gray. He called you the boy, I noted. To him, I'm always just property he lost, Vance replied. I walked toward the front door, but Harrison grabbed my shoulder. Arthur, don't. They'll shoot you before you can say a prayer. He won't, I said. Jax Blackwood is a man of old-world rules. He wants a parley. He thinks I'm the weak link. I stepped onto the porch, just as I had with Cade only hours before. The night air was cold, smelling of rain and diesel exhaust. The headlights made it hard to see, but I could make out Jax Blackwood standing at the foot of my steps. He looked older than the photos Vance had shown me, but his eyes, dark and predatory, were exactly the same as his son's. You're a long way from the foothills, Jax, I said, keeping my hands visible on the railing. And you're a long way from the pulpit, preacher, Jax replied, spitting a stream of tobacco juice onto my flower beds. I hear you had a busy day. My associate Cade Vane turned out to be a bit of a disappointment. A man who can't handle his own father-in-law isn't a man I can do business with. Cade is in custody, I said, and your shipment is being processed by the state. That was a lie, and we both knew it. Jax laughed, a dry, hacking sound. Don't lie to me, Arthur. You haven't called the feds yet. You're too afraid of what they'll find in that barn. You're afraid of the scandal. You're afraid that if the world finds out the Beaumont Sanctuary was a Blackwood hub, they'll take away every kid you've got left. You're protecting your legacy. He took a step forward, his boots crunching on the gravel. But here's the truth. Your legacy is standing right behind you. My son, the one you stole. Give me Vance, give me the keys to the barn, and I'll disappear back into the mountains. I'll even let you keep the house. Vance isn't yours to take, Jax, I said. He hasn't been yours since the day he walked through my door with a broken rib and a black eye. He's blood, Jax roared, his composure suddenly snapping. And blood is the only thing that's real in this world. Everything else, this house, your foster family, it's all just a fairy tale you tell yourself to feel holy. But when the lights go out, it's only blood that stays. I didn't know it yet, but Jax was about to show me exactly how far he'd go to prove that point. He raised his hand, and I heard the unmistakable clack-clack of 4 rifles being chambered. You have 5 minutes, Arthur, Jax said, his voice returning to a terrifying calm. After that, I start with the barn. And if the barn burns and my cargo goes with it, well, I'll just have to take the value out of your skin. I turned and went back inside. The room was silent. Vance was looking at me, his jaw set. We're not giving him anything, Vance said. We don't have to, I said. Harrison, where are those security guards? They're blocked at the main road, Harrison said, looking at his phone. Jax's men must have dropped a tree across the only entrance. They're coming in on foot, but it'll take them 15 minutes. We don't have 15 minutes, Leo said. He was looking at a smaller monitor. They're moving toward the barn already, 2 of them. I have an idea, I said. Vance, remember the quiet room in the cellar? The one with the reinforced door? Vance nodded. Yeah, it was built as a storm shelter. It wasn't just a storm shelter, I said. I never told you this, but the man who owned this house before me was a paranoid eccentric. There's a tunnel. It leads from the cellar directly into the tool shed behind the barn. It's narrow, and it's half collapsed, but it's there. Vance's eyes lit up. If we can get into the barn from the inside, we can catch them off guard. But we need a distraction. I'll be the distraction, Harrison said. I'll go out there and talk business. I'll offer him 10 times the value of his shipment to walk away. He knows who I am. He knows I have the cash. Greed will buy us the minutes we need. It was a dangerous plan, but it was the only one we had. As Harrison stepped onto the porch to face the wolf, Vance, Leo, and I headed into the dark, damp belly of the house. The tunnel was exactly as I remembered, smelling of earth and old wood. We crawled through the darkness, the sounds of the night muffled by the soil above us. My knees ached, and my lungs burned, but the sight of my children, one a lawman, one a shadow moving in sync, was enough to keep me going. We reached the tool shed and peered through the slats. 2 of Jax's men were at the barn door, struggling with the heavy padlock I'd replaced only a week ago. On my mark, Vance whispered. But before he could move, a third voice joined the fray. It wasn't Jax, and it wasn't one of his men. It was a voice that made my heart stop. You're looking in the wrong place, boys. I looked through the gap in the wood. Standing there, holding a kerosene lantern, was Silas Blackwood Jr., the cousin who had arrived with my children the night before. But he wasn't looking at the barn. He was looking at the tool shed. He's in there, Silas Jr. said, pointing directly at us. The preacher and the traitor. They're right under your feet. The betrayal was so sudden, so sharp, that I couldn't breathe. Silas Jr., the one who had promised to help us, had been Jax's mole the entire time. He had led us into a trap. Come out, Vance. Jax's voice boomed from just outside the shed. Or I'll toss a grenade in there and see how your sanctuary looks as a crater. I looked at Vance. He didn't look surprised. He looked tired. I didn't know it yet, Vance whispered to me. But Silas Jr. was never running from Jax. He was scouting for him. This whole thing, the veins, the shipment, it was all a setup to get us all in one place. The door to the tool shed was kicked open, and the moonlight spilled in, revealing Jax Blackwood holding a sawed-off shotgun. He wasn't looking for his cargo anymore. He was looking at his son. Family reunion, Vance? Jax sneered. Time to come home. What happened next changed the course of the night. Because as Jax stepped into the shed, the barn behind him didn't just open, it exploded. Not with a bomb, but with light. 4 massive floodlights, hidden in the eaves of the barn, turned the night into day. And from the darkness of the woods, a voice boomed over a megaphone, a voice that was cold, professional, and familiar. This is Lieutenant Vance Blackwood of the TBI. You are surrounded by 30 armed agents. Drop your weapons or be fired upon. Jax froze. He looked at Vance, who was still standing next to me in the shed. Then he looked toward the barn. Who the hell is that? Jax barked. Vance smiled, a cold, hard expression. That's Carlos Santos, Pop. Remember him? The kid you tried to recruit 10 years ago? He's a lieutenant now, and he's been sitting in that barn since 4 this afternoon. The table had turned again. But as the first shots began to ring out, I realized that Jax Blackwood wasn't the kind of man to surrender. He grabbed me, his rough hand slamming against my throat, and pulled me in front of him as a human shield. Nobody moves, Jax screamed, or the preacher gets a new hole in his head. I looked into the darkness of the woods, toward the children I'd raised, who were now aiming rifles at my heart. I didn't know it yet, but this was the moment that would define the Beaumont legacy forever. The cold steel of Jax Blackwood's shotgun pressed against the underside of my jaw, the metal smelling of CLP oil and old malice. I could feel the tremor in his hand, not from fear, but from the adrenaline of a man who had spent his life winning through violence and was suddenly staring at a scoreboard he didn't recognize. Behind us, the floodlights from the barn carved the night into jagged shapes of white and black. "Step back, Vance," Jax screamed, his breath hot against my ear. "Tell your brothers to lower those rifles, or the preacher's last sermon is going to be written in red on this toolshed wall." Vance stood 20 feet away, his TBI-issued Glock leveled with a steadiness that made my heart ache with pride and terror. Beside him, Leo Thorne was a statue, his eyes fixed on Jax's trigger finger. I'd seen these boys face down school bullies, broken hearts, and uncertain futures, but I'd never seen them look at a man with the kind of calculated, lethal intent they now held for Jax. "You're making a mistake, Jax," Vance said, his voice as flat as a Tennessee highway. "This isn't the foothills. You're surrounded by federal agents and men who have lived their entire lives waiting for a reason to put you in the ground. Let him go." "He's my leverage," Jax barked. "He's the only reason I'm not already a ghost." "Now, tell Carlos to open that barn door and let my men move the cargo, or I'll start with the preacher's ears." I didn't know it yet, but the cargo Jax was so obsessed with wasn't just the hardware Cade had brokered. There was something else hidden in that barn, something Cade Vane had kept secret even from his Blackwood business partners. It was the reversal Cade thought would save his life if the deal went south. "The barn is empty, Jax." Carlos Santos's voice boomed over the megaphone from the darkness. "We moved the crates 2 hours ago. You're holding a hostage for a room full of hay and memories." Jax's grip on my collar tightened, his knuckles white. "He's lying!" Cade said it was there. He said the special package was under the floorboards. That's when I saw it, the slight flicker in Silas Jr.'s eyes. The traitor cousin was standing near the edge of the tool shed, his shotgun lowered. He wasn't looking at the TBI agents. He was looking at the floor of the barn. He knew what the special package was, and he hadn't told Jax. "Silas?" Jax growled, sensing the shift. "What do you know?" "The preacher's right about one thing, Jax," Silas Jr. said, his voice trembling. "Cade was a snake. He didn't just broker the guns. He stole something from you. Something from the family vault in Nashville 3 months ago. He told me it was the only thing that would keep the Blackwoods from killing him once the house was in his name." The psychological tension in the air was so thick I could barely breathe. Jax Blackwood, a man who built an empire on loyalty and blood, was realizing that his own real family had been keeping secrets from him. "What did he steal?" Jax hissed. "The ledger," Silas Jr. whispered. "The one with the names. The judges, the senators, the DA in Knoxville. Cade had it hidden under the old grain scale in the barn. He was going to use it to blackmail his way into the governor's mansion." The revelation hit Jax like a physical blow. The ledger was the Blackwood Syndicate's lifeblood. It was the only thing that kept them out of prison. If the TBI got their hands on that, the entire Blackwood lineage would be erased in a single afternoon. "Is it there, Carlos?" Jax roared toward the barn. "Do you have the book?" Silence followed. Then, the sound of boots on the barn's wooden floorboards. Harrison Sterling walked out into the light, holding a small, leather-bound book wrapped in plastic. He held it up, the white floodlights reflecting off the cover. "You mean this, Jax?" Harrison asked. "I found it 10 minutes ago. It's amazing what a billionaire's legal team can find when they know what they're looking for. It's all here. Every bribe, every kickback, every name. Your entire world is in my hand." Jax's face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He wasn't thinking about the shipment anymore. He was thinking about survival. He looked at me, then at the book, then at his son. "Trade," Jax said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble. "The book for the preacher, and I walk out of here." "No," Vance said immediately. "We don't negotiate with terrorists, Jax. Especially not ones who share my DNA." "Vance, think about it," Jax screamed. "If that book goes to the feds, I'm dead anyway. I might as well take the preacher with me. You want to be a hero? Or you want to be an orphan again?" What happened next was a blur of motion and sound that I still see when I close my eyes. I knew these boys better than they knew themselves. I knew Vance was waiting for an opening, and I knew Leo was positioning himself for a kill shot. But I also knew Jax. He was going to fire the moment he realized he'd lost. I took a deep breath, the air cold in my lungs. "Vance," I said, my voice steady despite the gun at my throat. "Remember what I told you when you were 15? About the difference between a house and a home?" Vance's eyes flickered. He remembered. "A house is just wood and stone," I said, looking directly at my son. "But a home is where the people you love are safe. If this house has to fall for you to be free of this man, then let it fall." I didn't wait for a response. I leaned back with everything I had, throwing my weight against Jax's chest, knocking him off balance. It was a move a 72-year-old man had no business making, but it gave the boys the split second they needed. Crack. The sound of Leo's rifle echoed off the ridge. The bullet didn't hit Jax. It hit the lantern Silas Jr. was holding. The tool shed erupted in a ball of orange fire. The dry wood, soaked in decades of oil and dust, went up like a torch. Jax screamed as the heat scorched his arm, his grip on me loosening just enough. I rolled away, hitting the damp grass as the world turned into a chaotic symphony of shouts and gunfire. Vance was on us in seconds. He tackled Jax into the dirt, the two of them a whirlwind of shadow and light. It was a fight 20 years in the making, the foster son who had chosen the light against the father who had tried to drag him into the dark. "Get him out of here," Vance shouted to Leo. Leo grabbed me by the collar of my cardigan and dragged me toward the barn. Behind us, the tool shed was a roaring inferno, the flames licking the side of the Beaumont sanctuary. I watched, heartbroken, as the fire began to catch the porch I'd sat on for 30 years. "The house," I cried out. "Forget the house, Pop," Leo growled, shielding me with his body. "We've got you." In the driveway, Jax's men were trying to retreat, but Carlos's team had them pinned. Harrison was still standing in the light, the ledger tucked under his arm, looking like a king surveying a battlefield. But the real shock came from the shadows of the porch. Fade. Through the smoke and the fire, a figure emerged. It was Eleanor. She wasn't running for safety. She was holding a heavy iron fire poker, and she was heading straight for the fight between Vance and Jax. "Eleanor, no!" I screamed. She didn't listen. She had been the victim of the Vane's psychological warfare, and then she'd found out her husband had been a puppet for the Blackwoods. She was a woman who had been pushed past her breaking point, and she was done being afraid. Jax had pinned Vance to the ground, his thumbs pressing into Vance's eyes. He was laughing that horrible, dry cackle. "You're still my blood, boy. You don't have the stomach to kill your own." He didn't get to finish the sentence. Eleanor swung the poker with the strength of every foster kid who had ever been told they didn't belong. The iron connected with the back of Jax's head with a sickening thud. Jax slumped over, unconscious. Vance scrambled back, gasping for air, looking at his sister in shock. Eleanor stood over the fallen king of the Blackwoods, the fire reflecting in her eyes. "He's not our blood, Vance," she whispered, her voice like steel. "He's just a monster we let into the house." The TBI agents swarmed the driveway, finally taking control of the scene. Silas Jr. was face down in the dirt, arrested by his own cousin, Carlos Santos. Jax was being loaded onto a gurney, shackled and bleeding. The fire department arrived 15 minutes later, but the damage was done. The back of the sanctuary was a blackened husk. The tool shed a pile of glowing embers. The smell of smoke hung over Oak Ridge like a shroud. As the sun began to rise on Friday morning, I sat on the tailgate of Harrison's SUV, wrapped in a blanket. My children were all around me. Sarah was checking my neck for bruising. Julian was already on the phone with the insurance adjusters. Leo and Vance were standing together, watching the firemen douse the last of the flames. "I'm sorry about the house, Pop," Vance said, walking over and sitting beside me. "It's just wood, Vance," I said, resting my hand on his shoulder. "We're all here. That's what matters." But then, Harrison approached us, his expression grim. He was still holding the ledger. "There's something you need to see, Arthur," Harrison said, opening the book to the very last page. I looked at the names Cade Vane had added in his own neat, architectural handwriting. Names of the people who were supposed to facilitate the deed transfer of the sanctuary. My heart stopped. "I didn't know it yet," I whispered, the final piece of the betrayal falling into place. But the Vanes weren't the ones who started this. On the last page, listed as the primary financier for the Piedmont Group, the company that wanted my land, was a name that shattered what was left of my world. It was Dr. Sarah Miller, my own daughter, the one who was currently checking my pulse. The neurosurgeon who had helped organize the defense. I looked up at Sarah. She was looking at the ledger in Harrison's hand, and for the first time in 30 years, I didn't see my daughter. I saw a stranger with a plan. "I didn't think you'd actually find it, Harrison," Sarah said, her voice dropping the caring daughter act so fast it made my head spin. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the gunfire. My family, my real family, was about to face a betrayal that made Cade Vane look like an amateur. The air around the scorched remains of the Beaumont sanctuary was thick with the scent of wet ash and pine, but the coldness radiating from Dr. Sarah Miller was far more suffocating. I sat on the tailgate of the SUV, the heavy woolen blanket around my shoulders suddenly feeling like a lead weight. I looked at Sarah, the girl I'd held when she had her first fever, the woman I'd cheered for at her medical school graduation, and I realized I was looking at a stranger. "Sarah?" My voice was a cracked whisper, barely audible over the hiss of the fire hoses. "Harrison, tell me that's a mistake. Tell me I'm reading that wrong." Harrison Sterling didn't look at me. His eyes were locked on Sarah, his jaw so tight I thought his teeth might shatter. "It's no mistake, Pop. The Piedmont Group isn't just a development firm. It's a subsidiary of Miller Medical Holdings. Sarah, you didn't just know about the plan to take this land. You wrote the plan." Vance Blackwood stepped forward, his hand still resting on his service weapon, his face a mask of disbelief. "Sarah, we were just in a gunfight. We almost died defending this place. Leo almost burned alive in that shed. And you're the one who funded the people who brought the Blackwoods here?" Sarah didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She didn't offer a frantic explanation. She simply reached out, took a clinical-looking pair of glasses from her pocket, and put them on. The daughter was gone. In her place was a woman who navigated the corridors of power with the same precision she used to navigate a human brain. "Let's be adults about this," Sarah said, her voice devoid of the warmth that had defined her for 30 years. "The sanctuary is a sentimental relic, Arthur. It's 12 acres of prime real estate sitting on a geological gold mine for medical research. The Piedmont project wasn't about shopping malls or condos. It was about the Miller Institute, a state-of-the-art neurological center that would have saved thousands of lives. Lives that matter a lot more than the memories of a few dozen foster kids." "Sarah, stop," Eleanor sobbed, stepping away from her as if she were a ghost. "You were my sister. You helped me through the divorce. You told me to trust Cade." "Because Cade was a useful idiot," Sarah snapped, her patience finally fraying. "He was greedy, short-sighted, and desperate. I knew if I dangled the Vane legacy in front of him, he'd do the dirty work of getting the deed transferred. I didn't realize he'd be stupid enough to involve the Blackwoods. That was a variable I didn't account for. But honestly, the fire, the shootout, it only makes the case for eminent domain stronger. This property is now a public safety hazard." I felt a sharp pain in my chest that had nothing to do with my heart medication. I didn't know it yet, but the fire wasn't the most destructive thing on the property that night. It was the realization that I had raised a shark in a pond of goldfish. I had taught her to be smart, to be ambitious, to never let anyone tell her no. And she had turned those lessons into a weapon against the very man who gave them to her. "You poisoned me, Sarah," I said, the words tasting like copper. "Cade said it was a sedative, but he didn't have the medical knowledge to know what would simulate dementia without killing me. That was you, wasn't it? You gave him the dosage. You coached him on how to gaslight me." Sarah looked at me, and for a fleeting second, I saw a flicker of the little girl who used to be afraid of the dark. Then, it was gone, replaced by a terrifying, cold pragmatism. "It was for your own good, Arthur," she said. "You're 72. You were never going to leave this place voluntarily. I wanted you in the Laurels because it's the best facility in the country. I wanted you safe while I built something that actually mattered. I'm a surgeon. I make cuts so the body can heal. This house was a gangrenous limb. I was just removing it." The silence that followed was broken only by the crackle of a falling beam inside the house. My other children, Harrison, Vance, Leo, Julian, Carlos, stood in a semicircle around us. They were the elite of Tennessee, men and women of power and influence. But in that moment, we were all just children again, watching our family unit dissolve into ash. "You're not removing anything," Julian Montgomery said, stepping forward with the ledger. "Sarah, you might be a brilliant doctor, but you're a terrible criminal. You used your own holding company to wire the earnest money to the Piedmont Group. That's a paper trail a first-year law student could follow. And this ledger? It doesn't just have Jack's Blackwood's names. It has yours." Cade was keeping a separate tab on the doctor. "Every meeting, every wire transfer, every vial of sedative you provided." Sarah's composure slipped just for a moment. Her eyes darted to the book. Cade was a liar. That won't hold up in court. "Maybe not," Harrison said, his voice a low, vibrating growl. "But I don't need a court to destroy you, Sarah. I own the board of the hospital where you're chief of surgery. I've already sent a digital copy of this ledger to the medical board and the FBI. By noon today, your licenses will be suspended, your assets will be frozen, and you'll be the most famous pariah in the medical community." "You wouldn't," Sarah whispered. "We're family, Harrison. You'd destroy the Miller name, the reputation we all built. You destroyed the name when you touched Pop, Leo Thorne said, stepping out of the shadows. His face was streaked with soot, his eyes burning with a dark, vengeful light. I've spent 10 years in the corners of the world where people like you think you're safe. You're not. There is no family for someone who tries to bury their father alive. Sarah looked around at the wall of faces the brothers and sisters she had grown up with. She saw no mercy there. She saw the same righteous fury that had taken down Jack's Blackwood. Fine, Sarah said, her voice turning sharp and bitter. Destroy me. See what happens to the Beaumont Foundation when the founder's daughter is a convicted felon. See how many donors Harrison can keep when the scandal hits the front page. You think you're protecting Arthur? You're finishing what the fire started. She turned and walked toward her car, her heels clicking on the gravel. None of us stopped her. We watched her drive away, the taillights of her silver Lexus disappearing into the morning mist. I sank back onto the tailgate, my head in my hands. I had won the house, but I had lost a child. And in my world, that was a defeat I didn't know how to survive. Pop, Vance said, kneeling in front of me. It's over. We've got the ledger. We've got the Blackwoods, and we'll handle Sarah. I failed her, Vance, I whispered. I taught her to be strong, but I forgot to teach her to be kind. I was so proud of her success that I didn't see the rot. You didn't fail anyone, Eleanor said, sitting beside me and pulling the blanket tighter. She made her choice, just like Cade, just like Silas. They saw this house as an asset. We see it as a home. That's the difference. But I knew it wasn't that simple. Sarah was right about one thing. The scandal would be immense. The Beaumont Sanctuary was about to become the center of a federal investigation. The press would be relentless. The state would look at my foster license with a microscope. I looked at the charred remains of my home. The second floor was gone. The kitchen was a blackened pit. The photographs, the high-trum Bomboy Bayer pictures of my graduates, were likely nothing but ash. I didn't know it yet, but rock bottom has a basement. As the sun fully rose, illuminating the devastation, a black town car pulled into the drive. It wasn't the police. It wasn't the feds. An elderly woman stepped out, dressed in a sharp navy suit. It was Judge Evelyn Sterling Harrison's mother, a woman who had been my friend and ally for 40 years. She walked up to the group, her face solemn. She didn't look at the fire. She looked at me. Arthur, she said, her voice carrying the weight of the bench. I just got a call from the governor's office. Sarah didn't just fund the Piedmont Group. She promised the governor's brother a seat on the board of her new institute. The state isn't coming to help you, Arthur. They're coming to seize the property under a public endangerment emergency order. They want that ledger, and they want this land cleared before the news breaks. Harrison stood up, his face pale. They're coming now? The warrants were signed 30 minutes ago, Judge Sterling said. You have maybe 2 hours before the state police arrive to evacuate the premises and seal the records. They're going to bury everything Sarah did to protect the politicians she was in bed with. I looked at my children. We were tired, wounded, and standing on the ruins of our lives. And now, the very state I had served for 4 decades was coming to finish the job for my daughter. I didn't know it then, I said, standing up, the blanket falling from my shoulders. But I wasn't just a foster father anymore. I was a witness. And witnesses are a problem for people in power. What do we do, Pop? Leo asked, his hand drifting toward the pocket where he kept his knife. We don't hide. I said, a new kind of resolve hardening in my gut. And we don't wait for them to come to us. Julian, how many of the Beaumont kids are currently in the press or media? Julian blinked. 4. Marcus Vane, no relation to Cade, is an editor at the Tennessean. Sia Montgomery is a producer at CNN. There are others. Call them, I said. All of them. Every child who ever slept under this roof. Every child who ever ate at my table. Tell them the sanctuary is under attack. Not by criminals, but by the people who are supposed to protect us. I turned to Harrison. That ledger. I want it scanned and uploaded to a secure cloud server. Now. And Harrison? Send a copy to Sarah. Tell her she has 1 hour to confess everything to the FBI, or we release the names of the politicians she was buying. Pop. That's blackmail, Julian whispered. No, I said, looking at the smoke rising from my home. That's family business. Sarah wanted to play a high-stakes game. Well, it's time she learned that the shepherd knows how to deal with the wolves, even the ones he raised. What happened next changed the history of Tennessee. Because as the first state police cruisers appeared on the horizon, they didn't find a defenseless old man. They found a literal army. I didn't know it yet, but the reversal wasn't just about the land, it was about the truth. And the truth was about to go viral. The sirens didn't wail this time. They were low, rhythmic growls that pulsed through the morning mist, accompanied by the heavy, synchronized thrum of blacked-out Suburbans. The state police didn't arrive like a rescue party. They arrived like a cleanup crew. I stood on the edge of my driveway, the scorched skeleton of the Beaumont Sanctuary behind me, watching as 15 vehicles formed a semicircle at my gate. They were here to execute an emergency public safety order, a fancy legal term for disappear the problem before the sun comes up. I didn't know it yet, but the governor's office had spent the last 3 hours in a blind panic. Sarah's betrayal hadn't just been a family affair. She had promised the keys to my land to men who walked the halls of the state capitol. If that ledger Harrison held was made public, the subsequent scandal wouldn't just end Sarah's career, it would topple an entire administration. They needed that book, and they needed me silenced. "Arthur, they're breaching the perimeter," Julian Montgomery said, his eyes fixed on his tablet. "They've blocked the main road for 2 miles. They're claiming a toxic chemical hazard from the fire to keep the local news at bay." "Then it's a good thing our family doesn't wait for the local news," I replied. I looked at Harrison, who was standing on the charred remains of the front porch. He was on a satellite phone, his voice a low, commanding rumble. For 30 years, I had taught these children that the truth was their greatest shield. Now, Harrison was using it as a sword. "He's in position," Harrison said, snapping his phone shut. "Saya is overhead in the CNN chopper. Marcus is 3 minutes out with a convoy of independent press and a live feed mobile unit. We're not just going to tell the story, Pop. We're going to broadcast the siege." The lead SUV stopped 20 feet from the gate. A man stepped out, Major Garrett Vane, no relation to Cade, though the name seemed to haunt me. He was a man of iron and starch, his uniform crisp, his eyes hidden behind silver aviators. He didn't look at the fire. He didn't look at the weary group of foster children. He looked at me with the cold indifference of a man carrying out a corporate liquidation. "Arthur Beaumont?" And the major shouted, "I have a signed executive order from the governor's office. This property is declared a biohazard. You and your guests have 10 minutes to evacuate. All personal property, including all digital and paper records, are to be surrendered to the state for forensic auditing." "Forensic auditing," Vance Blackwood spat, stepping forward. He was still wearing his TBI vest, his badge gleaming like a warning. "You mean destruction of evidence, don't you, Major? You're here for the Blackwood Ledger. You're here to protect the governor's brother." Major Vane didn't blink. "Lieutenant Blackwood, you are currently off-duty and under administrative review, following the unauthorized discharge of firearms on this property. Step aside, or you will be detained for obstructing a state order." I felt the tension vibrate through my children. Leo Thorne moved into the shadows of the SUVs, his body tensed like a coiled spring. Carlos Santos and his team of Beaumont kids from the local PD stood their ground, a line of blue facing a line of black. This was the moment I had feared, the moment my family would be forced to fight the very law they had dedicated their lives to serving. "Major," I called out, my voice surprisingly steady. "You talk about orders. I talk about legacy. You have 10 minutes to clear the area, or the names on page 42 of this ledger will be live on every major news network in the world." The major paused. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. He checked his earpiece, unquote. The governor was likely screaming in his ear. "You're bluffing, Beaumont," the major said. "You wouldn't burn down the careers of innocent men." "Innocent?" I laughed, a dry, bitter sound. "The men who helped my daughter poison me? The men who facilitated the Blackwood Syndicate's transit through this county? There are no innocent men in that book, Major. Only men who haven't been caught yet." Just then, a low rumble shook the air. I looked up. A news helicopter, its belly marked with the red and white logo of a global network, cleared the ridge. The camera turret was pointed directly at the gate. Seconds later, a fleet of private vehicles, sedans, trucks, and a mobile broadcast van roared up the back road, bypassing the state police blockade through a dirt trail only the local kids knew. Out of the lead car stepped Marcus Miller and Sia Montgomery. They weren't just reporters. They were my children. Sia was already wearing her headset, pointing a finger at the state police as her cameraman began a live broadcast. "This is Sia Montgomery, reporting live from Oak Ridge." Her voice carried across the driveway. "What you are seeing is an unprecedented move by the state police to seize the home of retired chaplain Arthur Beaumont. We have reports of a massive corruption scandal involving the governor's office and a notorious crime syndicate. The emergency order you see being executed here is, according to legal experts, a direct attempt to suppress evidence. The major's face went from iron to ash. He looked at the helicopter, then at the live cameras, then at the line of 52 successful, powerful adults who were looking back at him with a lethal, unified glare. "Major Vane," Harrison said, walking down the steps with the ledger in his hand. "My legal team has just filed an emergency stay with the Federal District Court. Judge Marcus Williams, one of our own, has already signed the injunction. Your state order is null and void. If you don't back those vehicles off this property in the next 60 seconds, I'm going to sue you, your department, and the governor for every cent they have. And I have the bank accounts to make that a very long, very painful process." The standoff lasted an eternity. I watched the major's hand hover over his radio. He was a soldier at heart, and he knew when he had lost the high ground. He looked at me, a look of grudging respect or perhaps fear in his eyes. "Fall back," the major finally commanded into his radio. "Clear the gate. We're moving to the perimeter." The black Suburbans began to reverse, the synchronized growl of their engines sounding like a retreat. The Beaumont kids let out a cheer, but it was short-lived. We had won the battle at the gate, but the reversal was far from over. Because as the police moved back, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a FaceTime call. From Sarah. I hesitated, then answered. Her face appeared on the screen, her hair perfect, her office in Nashville looking as cold and sterile as ever. But behind her, I could see two men in suits. FBI. "I did it, Arthur," Sarah said, her voice sounding hollow, like she was speaking from the bottom of a well. "I gave them the names. Not just the ones in the ledger. I gave them the offshore accounts Cade was using. I gave them the Piedmont Group's internal memos." "Why, Sarah?" I asked. "Why now?" "Because Harrison was right," she whispered, a single tear finally tracking down her cheek. "I'm a surgeon. I know when a patient is terminal. The plan was dead the moment the house caught fire. I had to choose which side of the bars I wanted to be on. I'm trading my testimony for a suspended sentence and a fine. But they're coming for the rest of them, Dad. They're coming for everyone Cade and Silas touched." "And what about us, Sarah? What about the family?" She looked at me, and for the first time in years, I saw the daughter I used to know. "There is no us anymore, Arthur. I've burned my life down to stay out of a cell. I'm leaving the country. My medical license is gone. My reputation is gone. I'm going to a place where nobody knows the name Beaumont." She hung up before I could reply. I looked at my children, the ones who had stood by me, the ones who had fought. We had saved the sanctuary, but we had lost a sister to the very greed I had tried to protect her from. I didn't know it yet. But the final twist wasn't about the money or the land. It was about what was buried under the house. "Pop," Leo said, walking over to me. He was holding an old, metal lockbox he'd pulled from the crawl space beneath the charred kitchen. "The fire department said they found this when they were checking the foundation. It's been down there since the house was built in the 50s. I took the box. It was heavy, rusted, and smelled of earth. I pried it open with a screwdriver Julian handed me. Inside wasn't money or gold. It was a stack of letters. I pulled one out and read the date. June muy born, mutngin chincham nam muy born. It's from the original owner, I whispered. The man who built the sanctuary. I began to read, and as I did, my heart began to hammer against my ribs. The letters weren't just personal notes. They were a confession. The man had been a judge, the same judge who had started the foster care system in this county. And he had a secret. I didn't know it then, I said, looking up at Harrison and Vance. But this house wasn't just a place for foster kids. It was a sanctuary for a reason. The land. It doesn't belong to me. It doesn't belong to the Piedmont Group. What are you talking about? Harrison asked. According to these letters, I said, my voice trembling with the weight of the revelation, the land was placed in a perpetual trust for the descendants of the displaced. In Mutngin Chin Tram Namwi born, the judge bought this land to protect it from developers. But he didn't buy it for himself. He bought it for the children who had no blood relatives left. He created a legal loophole that means this land can never be owned by a single individual. It belongs to the children who live here, all of them. The realization hit like a thunderbolt. Sarah's plan, Cade's greed, the governor's corruption, it was all for nothing. The land was legally untouchable. It had been since before I was born. So the deed transfer Cade tried to force? Julian asked. Illegal from the start, I said. The house can be owned, but the land? It's a sovereign trust. It belongs to the Beaumont kids, to all 47 of you, and every child who comes after. The reversal was complete. The nobodies Sarah had mocked were now the legal owners of the most valuable land in the county. But as we stood there, realizing our victory, a dark shadow fell over the driveway. A final car, a battered, gray sedan, pulled up. Out stepped Martha Vane. She wasn't carrying a purse this time. She was carrying a canister of gasoline. Her eyes were wild, her mind clearly snapped by the loss of her husband, her son, and her dignity. She looked at the charred house, then at us. "If the Vanes can't have it," she shrieked, her voice a jagged glass edge, "then nobody can." I didn't know it yet. But the most dangerous enemy wasn't the one with a badge or a ledger. It was the one with nothing left to lose. Before anyone could move, Martha struck a match and threw it toward the open gas canister. The explosion rocked the driveway, but it wasn't the house that caught. It was the mobile broadcast van. "Get the kids!" I screamed. The final battle for the sanctuary wasn't against the law or the mob. It was against a mother's madness. And as the flames rose once more, I realized that the Beaumont story wasn't ending with a legal victory. It was ending with a sacrifice. The heat from the exploding media van was a physical wall, a roaring orange beast that clawed at the air. I saw Martha Vane standing in the flickering light, her face a distorted mask of grief and madness. She looked like a shadow burned into a wall, a woman who had spent her life measuring her worth by a name that had finally curdled into poison. She was reaching for a second canister when Vance and Leo moved. They didn't move like the boys I had raised. They moved like the men the world had forced them to become. Vance tackled her with a grim, protective urgency, while Leo used his jacket to smother a trail of flame licking toward the main house. There was no glory in it, no cinematic triumph. Just the heavy, sickening thud of a broken woman hitting the gravel and the frantic shouting of my children as they scrambled to keep the fire from claiming what little was left of the Beaumont sanctuary. I didn't know it then, but the explosion was the dying gasp of the Vane era in Oak Ridge. Martha was taken away in an ambulance, her mind fractured beyond repair, destined for a state facility far less comfortable than the one she'd planned for me. As the smoke finally began to clear, replaced by the cool, indifferent blue of a Tennessee morning, we were left standing in the ruins of 30 years. The back half of the house was a hollowed-out ribcage of blackened timber. My garden was a graveyard of ash, but as I stood there, clutching the rusted lockbox to my chest, I realized the fire had done something Cade Vane and the Blackwoods never could. It had stripped away the facade. It had burned off the Foster label I'd worn like a badge of humility for 4 decades. "Pop, you need to sit down," Sarah said, stepping toward me. I looked at her, my daughter, the doctor, the betrayer. She was still there, standing on the edge of the driveway, her silver Lexus idling behind her. The FBI agents who had been with her in the video call were nowhere to be seen. She had come to the ruins herself, perhaps to see if there was anything left to salvage of her soul. "You should go, Sarah," I said, my voice sounding like it was coming from a long way off. "The FBI is waiting for your formal statement in Nashville. Don't make them come looking for you." "I did what I had to do to save the family," she said, her voice trembling. "If I hadn't turned on Cade, if I hadn't given them the names, we'd all be in orange jumpsuits." "You did it to save Sarah Miller," Harrison Sterling said, stepping between us. He looked at her with a coldness that made the morning air feel like midwinter. "The family was just the collateral you traded to stay out of a cell. Now, get off this land. You heard the preacher. This property is a trust for the kids who actually want to be here. You don't qualify anymore." Sarah looked at the line of her siblings, the doctors, the lawyers, the survivors, and saw a wall she could no longer scale. She got into her car and drove away without a backward glance. I watched her go, a part of me mourning the girl she used to be, while the rest of me finally let go of the burden of trying to save a heart that didn't want to be rescued. We spent the next few hours in a daze of administrative chaos. Harrison's legal team arrived in a fleet of black sedans, effectively turning the driveway into a temporary law office. Julian and Marcus Williams, the federal judge who had flown in, sat at a folding table on the lawn, poring over the documents I'd found in the lockbox. The final twist, the one that would ensure the Beaumont sanctuary would never be threatened again, was buried in the very last letter of Judge Sterling Sr. A.S. confession. I watched as Julian's eyes widened, his finger tracing a line of elegant, faded cursive. "Arthur," Julian whispered, his voice cracking. "Did you ever wonder why the judge sold you this house for $1 back in Mtngin Chin Trum Chin We Born? Why he handpicked you out of every chaplain in the state? I thought he liked my sermons," I said, leaning against the SUV. "He didn't just like your sermons, Pop," Julian said, looking up at me with tears in his eyes. He was your grandfather, your biological mother. She was the daughter he'd disowned for marrying a common laborer. He spent his whole life watching you from a distance, watching you go into the ministry, watching you start taking in kids. He built this trust not just for displaced children, but specifically as an inheritance for his only grandson and the family that grandson chose to build. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. I had spent 72 years thinking I was a man with no history, a man who had to build a family from scratch because the real one didn't want him. And all that time, the very ground I was standing on had been a gift from a man who loved me in secret. The real family Cade had used to belittle me was right here. It was the land. It was the legacy. It was the blood I didn't even know I shared. I didn't know it yet. I told the kids as they gathered around, but I wasn't just the shepherd. I was the heir. And this house, it was never a project. It was a homecoming. The legal fallout was a tidal wave. Cade Vane and Silas Vane were indicted on 64 counts of fraud, elder abuse, and racketeering. The Blackwood Ledger, once the secret heart of Tennessee corruption, became the foundation for the largest federal sweep in state history. The governor resigned within the month. The Piedmont Group vanished into bankruptcy. But for us, the revenge wasn't in the prison sentences or the headlines. It was in the rebuilding. 6 months later, a new structure stood on the ridge in Oak Ridge. It wasn't the modest ranch house I'd lived in since the 90s. It was a sprawling, modern masterpiece of glass and timber, designed by one of the top architects in the country, another stray, I'd raised in the late 80s. It was the new Beaumont Sanctuary, a state-of-the-art facility for emergency foster placements, with wings named after the kids who had helped build it. The front porch was 3 times the size of the old one, with a row of rocking chairs that looked out over the valley. At the center of the house, in the main atrium, was the wall of photographs. Every single one of the High Trumbamwe Bay pictures had been digitally restored from the cloud backups Harrison had insisted on years ago. They were all there, the graduates, the soldiers, the doctors, and at the very end of the line was a new photo. It was Emma Chen, the 8-year-old girl who had arrived during the height of the storm. She was smiling, holding a puppy, her eyes finally free of the shadows that had haunted her when she first walked through my door. We held a dedication ceremony on a crisp October afternoon. Every one of the 47 kids who could travel was there. The driveway was a sea of luxury cars and family vans. We had a long table set up on the lawn, the same kind of potluck we used to have at the church. But this time, the food was catered by the best restaurants in Nashville, on Harrison's tab, of course. I sat in my center rocking chair, my hands resting on the smooth oak. Vance sat to my left, his TBI badge now replaced by the insignia of the Director of State Security. Eleanor sat to my right, her face radiant, finally free of the weight of Cade's lies. She was running the foundation now, ensuring that every kid who came through the sanctuary had the best legal and psychological support in the country. "You thinking about the move to the Laurels, Pop?" Vance teased, nudging my shoulder. "I think I'll stay here a bit longer," I said, a slow smile spreading across my face. "The view is better from this porch." As the sun began to set, casting long, golden shadows across the ridge, I looked out at my family. I saw Judge Marcus Williams playing catch with Harrison's sons. I saw Leo Thorne, who had finally come in from the cold, teaching Emma how to plant a sapling in the new garden. I saw a group of successful, powerful people who could have been anywhere in the world, but chose to be right here, on this dirt. I realized then that Cade Vane had been right about one thing. Family is about biology, but he'd gotten the definition wrong. Biology is just the heart beating in your chest. Family is the reason that heart bothers to beat at all. It's the people who show up when the house is on fire. It's the people who know your worst secrets and still call you Dad. It's the legacy that doesn't fit on a deed. I didn't know it yet, I whispered to the wind. But the best part of the story wasn't the revenge. It was the fact that we were still standing when the smoke cleared. I closed my eyes, listening to the laughter of my grandchildren and the clinking of silverware. The Beaumont Sanctuary was safe. The wolves were gone. And for the first time in 72 years, I wasn't just a foster father. I was home. And as the first star appeared over the Smoky Mountains, I knew that even if the world tried to burn it down again, they'd have to get through 52 of the most powerful people in the country to do it. And that was a battle I knew my children would never lose.